This story follows the life of Robert Smalls, a man whose life was so cinematic it feels like fiction. It's a tale of high-stakes theft, naval warfare, and a rise to the halls of Congress. The captain of the Planter, the great escape of Robert Smalls. The harbor of Charleston, South Carolina in May 1862 was a gauntlet of iron and fire. To the south lay the Confederate batteries, bristling with cannons ready to sink any ship that defied the rebellion. To the north, the Union blockade, a wall of federal steel, waited to seize anything that moved. In the middle of this death trap was the CSS Planter, a heavily armed Confederate transport ship. But on this foggy night, the man at the wheel wasn't a Confederate officer, he was a slave. And he wasn't just stealing a ship, he was stealing a country. The shadow in the pilot house. Robert Smalls was born into a world that told him he was property, but his mind had always been free. By the age of 23, he was a wheelman on the Planter. Though the law forbade black men from being pilots, Robert knew the shifting sandbars and treacherous tides of the South Carolina coast better than any white man in the Navy. He watched the Confederate officers, men who toasted to a future built on his back, and he memorized their habits. He memorized the signals. He memorized the tilt of the captain's hat. The plan was suicide. If caught, he wouldn't just be killed, he would be tortured as an example. But Robert looked at his wife, Hannah, and their 2 children, and decided that a life in chains was already a slow death. The night of the ghost ship. On the night of May 12, 1862, the 3 white officers of the Planter did exactly what Robert hoped they would. They went ashore for a night of revelry, leaving the ship in the hands of the enslaved crew. "Now," whispered Robert. The crew was terrified. They knew the stakes. Robert didn't just have his family to worry about, he had the families of his fellow crewmen. Under the cover of darkness, they picked up their wives and children at a hidden dock. As the women and children were huddled in the hold, weeping in silence, Robert donned the captain's signature straw hat and long overcoat. He pulled the whistle. 2 long blasts, 1 short, the Confederate signal to pass. Passing the gates of hell. The Planter steamed slowly toward Fort Sumter, the very place where the Civil War had begun. The massive stone fortress loomed like a titan in the mist. Robert stood in the pilot house, his face shadowed by the captain's hat. The sentry at Fort Sumter looked down. He saw the familiar silhouette of the Planter. He heard the correct signal. He saw the captain leaning casually against the window. "Pass, Planter!" shouted the sentry. Robert didn't breathe until the ship was out range of the heavy guns of the fort. But the danger wasn't over. He was now heading straight for the Union blockade. To the Americans on those ships, the Planter was an enemy vessel flying the palmetto flag of the Confederacy. "Lower the flag," Robert barked. "Raise the white sheet." As the sun began to peek over the Atlantic, the USS Onward spotted a Confederate steamer charging toward them. The Union sailors manned their guns. "Open fire!" the commander nearly shouted, until he saw it, a dirty white bedsheet fluttering from the mast. From property to patriot. When the Union sailors boarded, they didn't find Confederate officers. They found Robert Smalls, who tipped his hat and said, "Good morning, sir. I've brought you some of the Confederate New Year's presents." He handed over the ship, the heavy artillery on board, and most importantly, the Confederate code books. The news swept across the North like a wildfire. In a time when many doubted the courage or capability of black Americans, Robert Smalls became a living refutation of prejudice. President Abraham Lincoln was so moved by Smalls's bravery that it helped influence his decision to allow black men to enlist in the Union Army. The final triumph. Robert didn't stop at the escape. He became the first black captain of a U.S. vessel. He fought in 17 naval battles. After the war, he did the unthinkable. He returned to Charleston and bought the very house where he had been enslaved. He sat on the porch where his mother had served tea as a servant, but now he was a general in the state militia and a United States congressman. One day, he even walked into a local store and found his former master's wife, who was now penniless and suffering from dementia. In an act of radical grace that stunned the nation, he allowed her to live in his home until the day she died, because he could not see a woman suffer. The legacy. Robert Smalls proved that the American dream wasn't a gift given by the powerful. It was something that could be seized by a man with enough courage to steer a stolen ship through the mouth of a cannon. He spent 5 terms in Congress, fighting for public education and civil rights, proving that his true pilot skill wasn't just navigating the sea, but navigating the conscience of a nation.